For those of you that are new to Biyachad Together, an American Jewish University, I want to welcome you. You might want to say Shechianu because you've just walked into the gates of this little gem on Mulholland and the Brandeis Bardeen campus. We are known for our Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, our Moss Center for Jewish Journeys, Camp Al-Anim, Brandeis Bardeen, our School of Education, our business school, and so many other amazing programs, and I hope that you'll check them out. So now that everybody is joining us and we still have many other people coming in, I want to take a moment to introduce our esteemed guest this morning. Now, before I even read his bio, I just have to share a sweet story, which is that Jason was like, I think I know you. We were introduced by another mutual friend. He kept saying, I think I know you. And I thought, I don't think I know you. You don't look familiar, but I'm not sure. And yesterday of all days, he texted me, he goes, I figured it out. We were at a wedding together that you officiated, our dear friends Ellie and Simon Gluck. And I'm so happy that we share them in common because they are wonderful. And you were absolutely right. So I want to begin by saying you have an incredible memory. And I think everybody should know that because I didn't remember and I consider myself to have a good memory. What people also need to know about you, Jason, is that you are from a house of boys and you're in business with your family, which is pretty amazing. And we're going to talk about what it means to be a part of a family business because so many families do struggle from that. And when you talk about your family, you light up a room. You just light up a room. And you have parents that are Holocaust survivors. And I believe you're one of the very youngest people to have parents that are still living. Mostly it's grandparents. Is that correct, Jason?
We think so. It's it's. I was the very end of a generation, so
wow.
I was fortunate to be able to be exposed to that community.
Right, really impressive. And I mean, just also the fact that we have so few survivors still surviving, and the fact that your parents have a child. It's really. I hope we can talk about that as well. With a bachelor's degree in finance and a law degree from Cordoza, he was perfectly situated to go into his family's real estate development firm after a stint working for a large-scale urban development firm. In fall of 2001, he was this property, the first of the 60 group, 60 Thompson, was the pioneer in Soho's luxury lifestyle hotel sector. From there, they created the 60 Thompson Hotels, an award-winning brand that soon garnered international recognition and acclaim. For more than 12 years, Jason serves as the co-founder and creative director of Thompson Hotels. And along with his partners, which I believe are his brothers and his dad, he developed, rebranded, and renovated over 13 hotels through North America and UK. And if you know anything about the hospitality industry, you know running one hotel is a massive undertaking. So having 13 is no simple feat. I, as a Jewish mother, can't wait to set him up, but he is doing his thing, and his brothers work strategically as a think tank and board of directors, leveraging each of his own unique experience. I want to shout out to Soho Supper Club, who also connected us. So welcome, Jason. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
It's a true pleasure for me as well. So let's get right into it. The hospitality industry is literally burning right now because nobody is traveling and everything is being disrupted, but your industry in particular. So tell me what happened pre-COVID. How did you come to build the 60 with your brothers? What was the impetus? Where did it originate from? And then we'll talk about what's happened since.
Sure. Well, my brothers and I had always talked about the lack of kind of a more charming, more intimate, design-driven social experience in hotels in the US. And the charm of sort of a European small hotel that you would find in Paris or London and other cities really was kind of missing in the late 90s, early 2000s. So we truthfully just endeavored to build one here in Soho in New York and wanted to sort of see what happened. We had a background in real estate. We had some of the background in hospitality as well, and that the family had ventured into some commercial hotels and major urban centers and airports, but more of the traditional Hilton type products that people perceived as as mainstream at that time, and we really wanted to go our own direction. So it was innovative in that people didn't quite understand yet that how could you fill up a hotel without being part of a larger group, without being on a system, without having that kind of global feeder. And what happened was it proved to be that with the rise of the internet really growing into e-commerce, into travel, and New York going through its many cycles of interest in tourism and neighborhood growth, new neighborhoods like Soho and Lower East Side and the West Village really emerged. And the more charming boutique and design-driven product is what people craved. And we were able to use digital platforms to grow instead of being part of a larger system. So once we opened the first one, it thankfully was met with a lot of resounding respect and was successful. Immediately, people and institutions came to us and were wondering, can you do this for us, or can we do this together? And we grew quite quickly. And there were many, interesting twists and turns. We opened the day before 9/11, actually, was our first opening event. And, it was this fabulous, glamorous party during Fashion Week in New York. And, I was on this high. I was 29 years old at the time and not younger, and thinking, hey, I could really do this. This is interesting. And look at that rock star or that supermodel or that actor. And then the next day, the world sort of collapsed. So the adversity of having to ride that 9/11 wave through downtown New York, through the hospitality business, there were a lot of similar conversations of, hey, will people ever travel the same way again? Or will they ever come to big cities again, or tall buildings? Very much in the same way they're having that conversation today. And at the time, fairly quickly, people did come back, and it was stronger than it ever was before. And I believe that will be the case again post-COVID.
So interesting, because you have almost parallel situations, and you had a practice run with another world catastrophe, right? With a world tragedy of epic proportions. You started because your brothers were interested in you building a boutique hotel, which was completely novel at the time. We think of them as ubiquitous now, but at the time, nobody was doing them. But you had a little bit of background. Your dad ran rooming houses and grew up among survivors. Yeah, tell us about it.
We grew up in an interesting community, originally in Queens, where we were amongst a group of all very tight-knit group of Polish and Russian Holocaust survivors, all moved to the neighborhood in Queens and Rego Park, Forest Hills, Kew Gardens. And as immigrants, the kind of track record of how they would make it in the US, for many of them started with factories, manufacturing, clothing, embroidery. That was kind of the entree as an immigrant where you could get work. And once they saved up a little money, the only type of real estate they could really do was pooling together whatever capital they had and buying these somewhat dilapidated rooming house and SROs in Manhattan.
What are SROs? That's like
single-room occupancy hotels. So they're sort of big buildings with single rooms where people rent for extended periods of time. But at the time, it was a very rough and tumble business. But those SROs and those rooming houses became central location as Manhattan grew later on in the 70s, 80s, and 90s to become ultimately large format hotels. And, so there was this community of people who were just doing that because that's the only kind of career they could get to survive. And their children, many of which became some of the most successful and, interesting hotel operators in New York City.
So interesting. You grew up with some, like you mentioned, some very now powerful hotel operators. What was it like? Could you feel it in the blood? Like we're just struggling to survive, or they were like, let's make this a life. I mean, there's that immigrant mentality, and add on to that Holocaust, post-Holocaust mentality.
As a child, I was obviously much younger than the other children or kids in the community. In fact, I was closer to age to some of the grandchildren that were already coming about when in the 70s. So I didn't really experience the impact of where the trauma was so close. The children who were born in the 50s and 60s, it was much closer to them and they lived with it much more. By the time I came around, they were already more established, and what was really interesting to me in retrospect, as I look back on it now, is, we are in such a hypersensitive society where people are, live their personal demons or traumas out and wear that on their sleeve. These people suffered probably more than anyone in contemporary society in the US can comprehend. And they lived life full of joy and ambition and confidence, and they went on vacations and they played cards and they had parties, and it did not, that trauma was not allowed to rule their life. And, their children, had different reactions. Some who were closer to the fire, for lack of a better term, it was hard to break away from that shadow because they knew what was really going on. As time went by, though, I think others were very emboldened by the confidence of saying, if my parents, my father, my mother could survive this, I can be successful at whatever it is I choose to do.
And did you get the messaging that you're supposed to sort of even do better than they did? Like, were you hearing that message, or were you hearing the message of, just work hard and the American dream will come true? What was like the driving value you heard? Because you grew up in a very Jewish home.
For sure. And, I think it was, first was respect and be a good person, do the right thing by your family and by others. Second is, as long as, you have your health and you have your family and you have your support system, you need to go for it. Whatever that profession may be, it could be a doctor, it could be a lawyer, it could be a business person, but, we don't just sit passively by. And, and I think that ambition is, I think it wasn't done as a weight, it was done as a propellant.
Mm-hmm. It's so beautiful because you hear, I said at the beginning, your parents are survivors, but I hear more that they're thrivers. Like, they really communicated joy and love when they could have had a very different messaging. Both, not only that, they bridged you and your brothers together, right? Often families can be split apart. So I know there's a difference in age between you. How did it come about that you were going to work together, and how does that work every day?
They were working together already for many years out of school. And my father really wanted me to be an attorney when I was in school. And I enjoyed the study of law. I found it intellectually stimulating. You got to study things like war crimes and constitutional law and, things that you would normally read about on in the newspapers or watch on television. But I think once the practice of law became a reality, it was too confining for me. And, our discussion internally was, let's together kind of do our own thing. And our father was supportive once we made that decision, but he had an interesting perspective in that we were doing things that he was not accustomed to. So we were going into neighborhoods that, building projects in, downtown New York and the Lower East Side, as people who made it ultimately in the US and in New York, they, understood Midtown and Uptown. And I remember our first project, my father came to look under construction what we were doing, and we were sort of showing off, look how special it's going to be, and look at this street. And he looked at us and he looked around, and he, told a story about how when he came to America, what used to happen on those streets. And he just said, I wouldn't worry about it. 100 Michiganers will definitely want to stay here at some point in time. And that was his sort of vote of confidence of like, you'll make it happen.
Right. And also there's a real messaging of trusting you and having faith, which is something that they clearly probably pulled from surviving the Holocaust, right? That people that survived the Holocaust really talk about keeping faith in the face of a hopeless situation. So that sort of endorsement sounds a lot like how he just communicated to you on a regular basis. So at the beginning, we talked a little bit about the hospitality industry and how it's parallel, not exactly, but to post 9/11. So tell us what happened since the lockdown. Did the hotels go empty? What have you been seeing? What are you seeing now? And what do you predict for the future?
Well, the first several weeks, there was so much uncertainty. It was very difficult to make a strategic plan because nobody really knew how long or how severe the situation was going to be. But we decided very early on that we would close. And this was a very important decision for us to make. And, one, because many most hotels at that point decided to shut down because basically in a 2-week period, it went from, 80% in New York City to 5% maybe. And nobody knew how long that was going to last. And it was an unprecedented shutdown of air travel, train travel, legal lockdowns in, New York and other cities. So it was intimidating and quite scary for a lot of people. But we decided we needed to stay open. We needed to stay open for our employees. We needed to stay open for the communities that we were in, because our hotels are, somewhat in neighborhoods, and they always have been. And in those times of stress, they act as centers for the community. They see that there's activity. They see that there's a haven. And even if they don't use it, I think psychologically it makes a big impact. Wow. So we made that decision for better or for worse. And once we got into it, we did try to do our best we worked with first responders. We were providing some extended stay for people who ended up getting stuck. So we pivoted our business a lot week to week based on what was going on. And going into, let's call it post phase one of where we are right now, we're cautiously optimistic that the confidence in travel and the confidence in staying in hotels is starting to build back again.
Do you think it will be the same? I mean, I've stayed at a couple hotels since this shutdown began, just to get away from my dogs and kids and the whole thing. It's a very different experience. Have you changed the experience for people? And how do you see that morphing over time?
Well, I think we've changed the execution of certain things, partly temporarily, and then some things will stay long term. So people are obviously sensitive to contact, the check-in, and the entry of housekeeping and room service into your room, and privacy, and technology is taking a larger role in communication, and in particular in the check-in process. And some of that is here to stay. I think in the beginning, some of the brand standards were a bit extreme, and the CDC and science ultimately said, like, contact surfaces are not really the issue, and leaving rooms empty for 2 or 3 days doesn't really make a difference. But more intense cleaning procedures, more independent and technology-driven check-in and communication, those are things that are permanently probably going to stay with us in the hotel business.
It's interesting. And you do believe that it'll come back with a force and people will travel again?
I do. I think it's human nature to want to move around. I think we as a society have gotten even more adept and dependent on the wanderlust of exploration of travel, even domestically or drive time, or certainly internationally. I think this is a temporary situation. I think as medically we solve or abate or do what we can, people will want to break out and want to engage. Now, is in the long term, having cleaning procedures and having a different approach to hygiene and personal space, that's probably here with us to stay. And there's nothing wrong with that. Other societies have been doing that internationally for a very long time. But the general human nature to explore and to travel is something that I think we can't expect is going to change. And I think people don't make those seismic shifts lightly. And I think as we get into spring, we're going to see a large jump in activity.
I see your father's optimism coming right on through. I wanted to go back to something you said that I think was very powerful. To stay open was financially very challenging. And it sounds like your brothers and you made a decision because there was a higher goal, right? Keeping the community feeling like that you were part of the community, keeping people employed. How do you think your Jewish values informed that, or did they? I don't want to be a leading question.
Well, look, I think your personal moral value system, speaks to your business decisions and your personal ones, regardless of your religion. And, certainly in my case and in my brother's case, our Jewish upbringing and the sense of obligation to the community is very much part of the idea of providing safe haven, the idea of fighting on, the idea of not sending even the psychological message of abandonment. which is something that is important. I think it's important to the people we love. It's important to perfect strangers because they use us as an example.
Well, I think some of those things you just described are characteristic of Jews, but really are characteristic of the culture of Israel, which I know you're deeply connected to. So, what are the similarities between sort of Israel and how it has set itself up and the values that you just sort of shared?
Well, I think, it's interesting as an American-born Jew, you have different attitudes and different experiences as what your Judaism means to Israel. For me personally, and for many people that are in my community, they are very much hand in hand. And as much as our religion is sort of dictated by local community, by scripture, by, obviously the rabbis, many of our characteristics, whether we realize it directly or indirectly, are drawn from Zionism and from Israeli culture, because they are closer, in my belief, to what being a Jew as a nation is, not necessarily only as a religion, than what we've been able to do in the diaspora. And their attitude of always innovating, always being bold, their sense of community internally, their sense of the ability to go from trauma again and again on a daily basis, but always have an incredibly optimistic look forward as to what's going to happen in the future is a great example of how we should all be living our lives, especially when we're under this kind of stress.
I feel like I just want to quote you and put that on the wall and just share it everywhere. Like, the way we should be living our lives is with that sense of innovation and trust and faith. And I think people, especially now, are really struggling to find that. And we can look deeply to our Jewish wisdom, and we can look to our Israeli partners and our friends and our brothers to say, like, this is what you do. When you have trauma, people talk about Israel as being a state that's entirely in post-traumatic, right? And that it's when you have trauma, you pick up your bootstraps or whatever they're called. I don't know what even bootstraps are, but you pick them up and you look forward and you continue to pivot and innovate. And I can really see that in your personality, but in your ethos as a family. I know some people said that you went black screen. I think we are in the process of fixing it. We have so many questions already coming in, Jason. So I do want to pivot to the questions for a second. And some of them are very about the 60 hotels. And like I mentioned at the beginning, you want to stay on. Everybody usually stays on for the whole thing, but you really want to stay on because you guys are offering an incredible stay safe and stay 60 offer to the people that are participating today. And I think it speaks to your philanthropy, to your sense of obligation, and to your sense of philanthropy. So I love this first question. Would 60 Hotel consider opening in Israel?
We certainly would, and we've been exploring for many years trying to find the right opportunity. It's challenging, and because it's such a dynamic country with many aggressive real estate developers and hoteliers, but I think we'll get there eventually, and I certainly look forward to helping spearhead that project one day.
And what cities are you in currently? And you don't have to ramble them all off, but maybe
Right now, we're primarily in New York and Los Angeles, with upcoming projects new projects in New York and Los Angeles and South Florida.
Well, and so Israel is on deck.
We hope, we do.
Right, Israel Hotels, they have a whole groups there of really innovative hoteliers. I think you would not only give them a run for their money, but I think you would really elevate each other tremendously. So I love that. So someone asked, the 60s Hotels was so novel when you guys started, and now this boutique business has really blossomed. Each category or each hotel has its own criteria of the audience it's looking for. Like, when you describe your perfect guest, who are you aiming to satisfy?
We try
to be all over the place, Jason, I promise.
No, that's good, though. We like that. I think when we start a project, and in various aspects of my career, I personally kind of concepted probably about 20 to 25 hotels, at least in its early stages. And each time you sort of cinematically view what's going on in the space and who your potential guests are going to be. And without fail, it's always an eclectic mix. And I think that combination makes things really interesting because hotels are very much about escapism. So regardless of who your guest is when they come in, it's really more about who they aspire to be. And whether you're, a dentist from Omaha or whether you're a fashion designer from Paris, you change something about yourself when you kind of come into this space and, you enter your different personality for those few days that you're there. And I think that's universally true, regardless of age and regardless of where you're from. It's always this idea of escape from your reality.
So first of all, I've never thought about hotels like that, especially because I traveled so much for work when I was traveling for Hillel and publishing books and doing television. So I never thought of it like that, but you do get to reinvent yourself. It's sort of analogous to camp. I don't know, did you go to Jewish camp?
I didn't. I did as a little child, but then I actually traveled with my family since the time I was about 7. So that was my summer camp.
So that was your summer camp. But I do think that camp has that same sort of feel where you can go there and aspire to be someone else and practice wearing that wardrobe or that mask, or even finding those aspects of yourselves. I think it's very similar to Purim, right? It's similar to the holiday where you put on another part of yourself in order to aspire to grow another part of yourself. And I love the idea of thinking of hotels like that. So we do have some Holocaust survivors on the call, which I think is so beautiful. I want to interview every single survivor. I want Spielberg to do just a show where we just show every single one of those videos that he prepared. But could you briefly share a little bit about your parents' Holocaust experience? And if it's private, of course, you can refuse.
My father grew up in southeastern Poland in a small town called Włodawa, which is sort of the biggest city nearby, I guess would have been Lodz. It's almost on the Russian border by the Bug River. And it was a relatively small town. And he, though, spent the war in the partisans. He was in the woods as a resistance fighter. He was wounded in the middle of the war and spent then some time with the Russian partisans. And he and 2 of his brothers survived along with 1 sister. His parents and 2 little sisters were massacred in the liquidation of the village, but the other siblings have been able to escape to the woods and fought their way through the war. For many of you who have seen the movie Defiance, it's a very similar narrative, and that group were also nearby and friends of my father, Bielski family, had a very similar type experience. And it's a little different than I think many people who experienced the camps, because even though it was traumatic, it was to a degree somewhat empowering to be able to fight back. And I think that molded my father and uncle's attitudes as they got past the war and into the future. My mother somewhat got...
Was your father and brother and sister together fighting as partisans?
Yeah, they were.
And they all survived?
Yes, his older sister, he had 1 more older sister and younger sister did not, and his parents unfortunately did not, but the rest of them survived.
And is his brother and sister still living today?
Unfortunately, they had all passed by now. They were all older, but they all ended up having lives, and some in Europe, Israel, and here in New York.
So a real fighting spirit also in that. And we're going to go back to your mom in a second, but it used to be 30 years ago that the impression was that Holocaust survivors just were sheep being slaughtered, and many of them didn't have a choice. But there's a huge emergence of scholarship now about all the partisanship and all the fighting back and all the rebellions, and they're discovering so much wealth of information there, which is really interesting. It's like they didn't go down lightly, right? They were fighters, and my great uncle was one of the 200 that came out of Lodz and out of the Treblinka, and he was one of the 12 that survived, right? So amazing. It's an incredible story. I'm sure they probably know each other through the Holocaust community. I know it's not that big, sadly. It's not that big. And your mother?
My mother was somewhat fortunate in that her family ran to across the border into Russia when the war started. Her father had died of natural causes before the war, but her two sisters and brother and mother were ended up in Siberia in a displaced persons camp for the war, and had no idea what was going on in for the rest of the Jewish community. So they thought they were really kind of the ones suffering because it was quite unpleasant. But only after the war did they find out what had really happened to their town and to their people.
Wow. Wow. So it's a difficult pivot because I could sit and listen to those stories all day long, and I can't wait to meet your parents in person. But we do have a few more questions about the hotels. So I want to throw them over. People ask that they support small hotels and boutiques a lot, but they don't support chains. And so what's the difference? Like, at what point do you become a chain, and at what point are you still a boutique hotel with all those values?
Well, the line has certainly gotten blurry because the chains have either bought or started what they perceive it to be boutique brands that are modeled after the aesthetic and the kind of general execution of what we call the sort of first wave of the early 2000s, which included 60 Thompson and some other hotels in New York. But I also view as, each hotel is its own personality. It's its own character in this play. And part of it is, where is the ownership? Is it institutional, or is there actually a person or people behind it? And are they there, and are they engaged? And is it quirky? And are they making unique experiences that are not standardized? And, if you're getting the same experience in Puerto Rico or Miami Beach as you are in Minneapolis, Minnesota, or Seattle, you're pretty much in a chain. It doesn't matter, how they dress it. But if you're getting this unique, hyper-localized experience that is very particular to your location and the vibe of what you're trying to kind of feel, I think that is different.
Yeah, I think that was a beautiful answer, because I think at each of your hotels, it's a very different experience. And often I've been surprised when I'm like, oh, this is a 60? Tell me, what one person just wants to know if you're small dog friendly. I'm sure it's on the website, but since we're here, let's ask. Are you small dog friendly? My dog Laka wants to know.
What's that?
Are you small dog friendly?
We are on a case-by-case basis. Yes, we are. We are small dog friendly.
And I mean, people ask, so I'm sure it's on the website too, which, remind us of the website again, 60hotels.com?
60hotels.com, spelled out, SIXTY,
Yeah, easy.
hotels.com.
What location has been the most visited over the pandemic? Is there one that stood out or has surprised you?
It really comes in waves. We go and take these really big swings and one location to another, and because the pandemic was changing so much so quickly. In the beginning, New York was sort of persona non grata for anyone who could get out of here was running, and California or other states were getting people running to kind of get warm weather or places they perceived were a bit more under control or more comfortable. And then the pendulum shifted again. And New York all of a sudden is this, somewhat locally vibrant scene downtown again. And there are other states that are having a hard time. So, you'll see that up and down a little bit, but I do think people, and I particularly noticed this in midsummer when I was traveling in California a bit, people are really yearning to get out and do things. And they should not be afraid. They should not be afraid to come to New York City for sure. It's become very in vogue to criticize New York right now and predict its doom and gloom. And, that's been done for New York more times than I can remember in my own lifetime. So over the years before that, countless amounts of times, and New York will come back again. And to a degree, it's already on its way. So I think we should not fear. Things are under control, and it's an exciting place as it always was.
And I love to hear that endorsement, especially coming from someone who's there on the ground. One question that came, there's a number of questions. I'm like surprised by how many, but why is it called 60?
Because the first one was at 60 Thompson Street, the address.
Right. I actually read that and then I forgot.
Yeah.
And There's a big shout out that you guys need to come to Dallas. They love your hotels. They're former New Yorkers.
I
Stay
love Dallas.
Dallas is on the list, correct? Hopefully.
Absolutely.
Um,
Because my mother's older sister still living is in Dallas. She's 90. Well, she'll kill me if I say her age, but let's just say she's a wonderful woman. Aunt Ruth, we miss you. So
she's 29 over again. But I also
yes.
think, I love that you just said that. Like, you're really driven by the family ethic, right? Like, your first response to Dallas was not, my God, the property there and the money and this. Your first response is like, my aunt, who shall age should be named, not named, lives there.
Absolutely.
And it's really clear that you run the business with love, with family, and with values, which is one of the reasons I really wanted to have you on the platform, because we're really looking for people to tell their story and how their Judaism drives their story. So what was the inspiration? Someone asked, you've been to other hotels in the past. Before you built 60, was there any hotel that inspired you from the 1950s, 1960s? Was there something that you thought, this could lead to something?
We traveled a lot when I was a kid because I was the youngest. My parents were old already and sort of didn't have patience for the kind of summer camp and, kid to kid culture. So they kind of just packed me up and took me around. And it was great as a young child to see places through an adult's eyes and try to understand why it was special to stay in a hotel. And those hotels were not emblematic of what I ended up doing. They laid the idea of the culture of hospitality a little bit, and the idea of escapism, because for us it certainly was. Once I was older and in school, I think the original Ian Schrager hotels had a deep impact on me. And when you could walk into places and they'd look nothing like anything that people would perceive as a hotel, and this dynamic of youthful energy and it changed, I think, the entire industry. So I'm not alone in that. But then once the wave started, I think we all take inspiration from stuff that's happening all the time. So, I take inspiration for hotels that are, opening recently, and, everybody's doing their own thing. And it's exciting to see how diverse a place can be in Asia versus in Paris versus in New York City. I think, my first trip to Asia was really eye-opening as to how dramatically different hospitality culture, food and beverage culture, just the whole idea of service culture could be. And I think it continues to for many people in the industry.
You said something that caught my attention, which is that every one of us has a moment when they stayed in their first hotel or a memory that they're like, it's forever, imprinted on them. Do you have one of those memories as a kid staying in a hotel? And I mean, I remember mine, so I'll tell you mine after, but I want to hear what yours was.
It's funny for me, it was two, right? So my first trip to London, I was probably 8 years old. And we stayed, I don't even remember the name of the hotel, but it was a grand kind of old British style hotel. And we came in late and I was just so awestruck by how proper everybody was and the way the waiters kind of spoke to me as a child, even with this sort of formal culture that he took such pride in his job and being able to kind of show me, like, this is how, we serve an iced tea or whatever I was drinking at that age as a child. And, that pride in culture, I think, is something that stayed with me. And then we spent a lot of time in Israel and in the Tel Aviv Hilton, which became this kind of clubhouse for a global international group of Jews, of kids of my generation. And I think that's where the kind of clubhouse social culture kind of showed its face to me, where you went to a hotel and its lobby and its pool and its bars and its restaurant again and again and again to kind of reconnect with a certain group of people that you feel kinship to. And, that's kind of culturally what we try to do in each neighborhood that we've gone to as we've opened new hotels around the world.
I'm sitting here smiling from ear to ear, thinking, like, I imagine what we were going to talk about, and it's someone just wrote in, he's such a mensch and a family man. Go Marlins, right? Like, it's so obvious, Jason, how much it's important to us at AJU to elevate Jewish wisdom in the world, and you do that by elevating Jews. So a couple final questions. I can't stop staring. What's behind you is Spider-Man climbing through the pyramids. You got to tell me about that picture.
Actually, I didn't plan that, but that is a friend of mine. Let me see if I can get my head out of the way. He's an Israeli artist named Dedi Kasman, and he was a commando in the special forces in Israel. And his brother, who was also a commando in the special forces in Israel, suffered a severe case of PSD after some members of his unit got killed. And in order to heal his brother, he dressed him up as Spider-Man, which was his favorite superhero, and took him around the world to sites of Jewish oppression and photographed him sort of leaping through the cemeteries of Berlin, the pyramids of Egypt, other places around the world. It's a very interesting series, and I encourage you to sort of Google him. And David Katzman is his name, and he's a wonderful photographer. But the social messaging behind it, and that's actually his brother in the Spider-Man suit that he's shooting.
Okay, first of all, you come sit down again. I so didn't expect that answer, and his name's David
Katzman.
Katzman, Kassman.
Yeah.
I mean, I was so surprised by that story, and I'm so glad I asked, because I was like, I'm so curious. And the fact that it just weaves perfectly into this whole story today. So I promised at the end that the 60 hotels and Jason and his brothers were going to offer something very special, and we're going to put it in the Q&A. They are offering a Stay Safe and Say 60 special deal for everyone who's participated today. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, I think in the idea of encouraging people to travel again, and even getting some of the local community in New York and LA to maybe leave their homes and have a little staycation, we've come up with a package which is, a discount to what's being served now, plus it's a severe discount to what normally is in this time of year, and there's some branded masks and materials and late checkouts, and we've tried to make it super comfortable, to make it affordable for people to stay in hotels that, at other times maybe, it's a little more challenging, but most of all, it's to encourage people to re-engage in tourism. So we'd love, your listeners and the community to take part in it.
And I just want to say, it completely flows from who you are and your family values that you guys would offer this, and that it's a little special perk. And I hope that those that are listening will also share it with their friends. And just to get away to one of your hotels, to me, is like going to heaven. Like, it's just having a moment to literally escape the mundane and to reimagine what could be. Before we close, I want to remind everybody, this was not unplanned that we talked about hospitality this week, because it is the holiday of Sukkot, the moment that we invite the Ushpizin, the guest, into our home, because we are people that are hospitable and welcoming. And it was intentional that I wanted to have Jason on the platform, but even more intentional that you spoke to it so beautifully, and you spoke to truly a 5,000-year-old history of welcoming the stranger and welcoming everyone into your home and into your heart. And you have done that for us today, Jason. Thank you for having me. It was such a pleasure. For those of you who just came today to see Jason, come back, because this is just a sampling of what we're here offering at Biyachad. For those of you that join us regularly, we're blessed. We're blessed to have so many amazing Jews doing incredible things of all ages. I hope that you will come back again and again. I hope that you'll take our classes. Tomorrow, Nissim Black, who happens to be Black, who was a rapper that grew up in a very rough neighborhood, is going to be on the platform talking about his journey to Orthodox Judaism and to becoming a world-renowned rapper. It is not to be missed. He's incredible. And so I just want to thank you all. I want to tell everybody to stay safe, to stay well. Chag Sameach. Enjoy your Sukkah. Use your 60 Stay Safe coupon, it's sort of a, I don't know what they call it, but use your incentive, get away for a moment just to imagine what could be, because hope and faith are on the other side, and you really, truly exemplify that today. Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you. To see you soon. Thanks to everyone who listens.
Thank you. And we'll see you soon.